Our 2018 Crystal Globe Award goes to Dan and Elise Coker. You cannot talk about Latin American missions in our fellowship without their name coming up in the first 60 seconds.
It's very difficult, I think, for people today to realize how very, very little our brotherhood knew about Central America back in the 50s.
In 1963, we decided to go to Guatemala.
But our parents were not so agreeable because we had been married for 6 years and were finally having our first baby, and they felt like, well, we needed to stay in the States until after the baby was born.
But we assured them that babies were born every day in Guatemala.
And so we just bit the bullet and just decided to get started on that venture.
Dan and Elise have lived in about 5 countries of Latin America. And Dan just had a knack with languages. He was very articulate. If we had done a better job in utilizing the potential that Dan Coker had, he could have been the Billy Graham for Churches of Christ. He could have filled soccer stadiums.
And he connected with the people because he knew them.
I felt very strongly that in order to have the right to expect them to listen to me and my expectations and concerns, that I owed them the courtesy of listening to them and their expectations and concern first.
Then he was hired by the Honduran government to help recommend changes to the higher educational system in Honduras.
But we also, of course, wanted to do what we could to establish a congregation there. There were no Churches of Christ in Honduras at that time.
He showed a generation of missionaries that sometimes maybe the best way to do mission work was to work at a secular job. And when you look at the church today in Honduras, so many of those are traceable to that work that they did when Dan got off work.
But that person that I've been most impressed with is Elise. I've been in some of the places that they had to live, and I know that Elise had to give up a lot of physical comfort. She is the most uncomplaining person I've ever met.
Where Dan was working, Elise was working. Dan was extremely wise in the cultures of countries and not wanting to create a sense of dependency amongst Latin Americans, but to help them to be trained in Scripture.
When you're dealing in an area where you're dealing mostly with first-generation Christians, they need some way of developing their skills in Bible knowledge and in using that Bible knowledge to make the church grow.
And that was the beginnings of what was known as the Instituto Latinoamérica de Estudios Bíblicos, or the Latin American Institute for Biblical Studies.
And it's been a great success.
I think of all the people that are going to be in heaven someday because of the work that Dan and Elise have done.
One thing that just thrilled Jerry Hill and me, in 2009, he and I were invited by the Brethren in Guatemala to come celebrate the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the church. And we had asked that they bring an accounting of the different congregations of the faithful members, and the total was over 40,000. And on a business meeting at the end of the second day of the celebration, one of the elders stood up and said, "Tell the people back in the United States that we are so grateful for what they've done for us, to tell them to send that money somewhere else now, because we're going to assume the responsibility of those who are in need." And that was one of the greatest days that we ever had in the mission field, was that day.
I think of excellence, I think of perseverance, and I think of sacrifice.
They are just people of legendary significance and unimpeachable integrity. And it's high time that we recognize that and we honor them. And I'm so delighted that we can do that this year.
They've given up a lot, they've done a lot, but they did it all for the love of the Latin American people and for the love of the Lord.